Welcome to the channel. Before we start today's story, I think it would be interesting if you could tell me in the comments which city in the world you're watching this video from. Leave your comments so we can see how far this story has reached. Click the like button and subscribe. All of this because Greg Daniels inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp Montana air as he stepped out of his battered pickup truck. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking area near Flathead River. He grabbed his fly fishing gear from the truck bed, excitement coursing through his veins. Perfect conditions, he muttered, scanning the sky. A few wispy clouds drifted lazily overhead, and a gentle breeze rustled the pines lining the riverbank. Greg made his way down the well-worn trail, his boots crunching on gravel and pine needles. The sound of rushing water grew louder with each step. As he emerged from the tree-line, the Flathead River sprawled before him, its waters glinting in the early morning light. He paused, taking in the scene. Mist rose from the river's surface, creating an ethereal atmosphere. The opposite bank was a wall of dense forest, its reflection shimmering on the water's surface. "Time to sit up," Greg said to himself, shrugging off his backpack. He assembled his rod with practiced ease, fingers moving deftly over the familiar equipment. The rhythmic click of the reel as he attached it was music to his ears. Greg selected a fly from his box, a small iridescent creation meant to mimic the local insects. As he worked, a movement on the far bank caught his eye. Greg froze, squinting across the river. A large, dark shape emerged from the tree-line, a black bear, its coat glistening in the sunlight. Greg's heart rate quickened. He'd encountered bears before, but never this close. The bear seemed unaware of his presence, ambling along the water's edge, likely in search of its own breakfast. "Easy there, big fella," Greg whispered, though the bear was far out of earshot. "You stick to your side, I'll stick to mine." He watched the bear for a few moments longer, then returned to his preparations. The animal was a good distance away, and black bears were generally less aggressive than their grizzly cousins. Still, Greg made a mental note to keep an eye on its movements. With his gear ready, Greg waded into the shallows. The icy water seeped into his waders, sending a shiver up his spine. He took a deep breath, centering himself. "All right, let's see what's biting today," he murmured. Greg began to cast, the line arcing gracefully through the air. The fly landed softly on the water surface, floating downstream. He repeated the motion, each cast a meditation in itself. The world narrowed to the river, the rod, and the anticipation of a strike. Time seemed to slow as Greg fell into the familiar rhythm. Cast, drift, retrieve. Cast, drift, retrieve. The tension in his shoulders melted away, replaced by a deep sense of contentment. A splash from across the river broke his reverie. The bear had waded into the shallows, sawing at the water. Greg tensed, but the animal seemed focused on its own fishing attempts. "Looks like we've got some competition," Greg chuckled nervously. He cast again, trying to push the bear's presence from his mind. The fly landed in a promising eddy, swirling tantalizingly on the surface. Suddenly, there was a flash of silver beneath the water. Greg's instincts took over. He gave a slight twitch of the rod, setting the hook. The line went taut, and a grin spread across his face. "Got one," he exclaimed, his voice echoing across the water. The fish fought valiantly, darting back and forth in the current. Greg played it skillfully, giving line when needed, reeling in when he could. After a few exhilarating minutes, he guided a beautiful rainbow trout into his net. "What a beauty," Greg said, admiring the fish's vibrant colors. As he removed the hook, preparing to release the trout, a loud splash from upstream made him snap his head up. The bear had abandoned its own fishing spot and was now moving swiftly through the water, straight towards Greg. Fear gripped him as he realized his mistake. The commotion of the fight, his excited shout, he'd drawn the bear's attention. And now, with a fish in hand, he'd become a target. "No, no, no," Greg muttered, his hands shaking as he fumbled to release the fish. The bear's powerful strokes ate up the distance between them with alarming speed. Its eyes were fixed on Greg, or more accurately, on the fish in his hands. Greg finally managed to free the trout, practically throwing it back into the river. But it was too late. The bear was barely 20 yards away now, its massive form cutting through the water with surprising agility. "Hey, get out of here," Greg shouted, waving his arms and trying to make himself look bigger. His voice cracked with fear, undermining any attempt at intimidation. The bear paused momentarily, seeming startled by Greg's sudden movement. For a brief, hopeful moment, Greg thought it might turn back. Then the animal let out a low, rumbling growl that sent ice through Greg's veins. "Oh God," he whispered, realizing the gravity of his situation. The fishing rod slipped from his numb fingers, clattering against the rocks beneath the water. Greg began to back away slowly, his eyes never leaving the advancing bear. Each step was agonizingly slow, the waders hampering his movement in the knee-deep water. "Easy now," Greg said, his voice trembling. "I don't want any trouble." The bear tilted its head, as if considering Greg's words. Then, with a powerful lunge, it surged forward. Greg's survival instincts kicked in. He turned and began to splash towards the shore, his heart pounding in his ears. The rocky riverbed threatened to trip him with every step, but fear lent speed to his clumsy retreat. As he reached the shallows, Greg risked a glance over his shoulder. The bear was alarmingly close, its eyes fixed on him with predatory intensity. In that moment, Greg realized that his peaceful morning of fishing had turned into a desperate fight for survival. The idyllic scenery of the Flathead River faded into the background as primal fear took hold. The only reality now was the thundering of his heart, the burn of his muscles, and the terrifying presence of the bear behind him. As Greg scrambled onto the riverbank, gasping for breath, he knew that his ordeal was far from over. The true test of his survival skills was just beginning. Greg's feet hit solid ground as he stumbled onto the riverbank, his heart pounding. He spun around, expecting the bear to be right behind him. To his relief, the animal had stopped at the water's edge, watching him intently. "Easy there, big guy," Greg said, voice quavering. "Let's just stay calm." He slowly backed away, maintaining eye contact. The bear huffed, pacing along the shoreline. Greg's mind raced, trying to recall everything he knew about bear encounters. "Tay bear, go away," he shouted, clapping his hands. The bear flinched but didn't retreat. Greg fumbled for his bear spray, cursing when he realized it was in his backpack, several yards away. He inched towards it, never taking his eyes off the bear. Suddenly, the bear lunged forward. Greg's survival instincts kicked in. He turned and ran, abandoning his gear. "Help!" he yelled, though he knew no one was likely to hear. The sound of heavy breathing and crashing undergrowth told him the bear was in pursuit. Greg's waders hindered his movement. He stumbled, nearly falling. The bear was gaining ground. In desperation, Greg veered towards a cluster of trees. He spotted a sturdy-looking pine and made a beeline for it. Come on," he muttered, reaching for the lowest branch. With a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, he hauled himself up. The bear arrived seconds later, rearing up on its hind legs. Its claws raked the air inches from Greg's boots as he scrambled higher. "Stay back," Greg shouted, his voice cracking with fear. From his perch, Greg could see the full size of his pursuer. The bear was massive, easily over 300 pounds. Its black fur was matted in places, and a scar ran across its muzzle, evidence of past encounters. The bear circled the tree, occasionally standing to swat at Greg's dangling feet. Greg climbed higher, the branches growing thinner. "Please, just go away," he pleaded, knowing it was futile. Minutes stretched into an hour. The bear showed no signs of losing interest. Greg's arms ached from clinging to the branches. He tried to shift his position for better comfort. Crack! The branch beneath Greg's feet gave way. He scrambled for a handhold, but gravity won out. With a sickening lurch, he plummeted towards the ground and the waiting bear. Greg hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. He rolled, narrowly avoiding the bear's massive paw. Adrenaline surged as he scrambled to his feet and sprinted along the riverbank. "Help! Somebody!" Greg shouted, voice hoarse with terror. The bear pursued, its heavy footfalls too close for comfort. Greg's waders hampered his movement, but fear propelled him forward. He zigzagged, hoping to confuse the predator. Spotting a dense patch of forest ahead, Greg veered towards it. Branches whipped his face as he plunged into the undergrowth. The bear crashed through behind him, undeterred. Greg's lungs burned. He risked a glance back and stumbled, nearly falling. The bear was gaining ground, jaws snapping. "God, trees!" Greg gasped, pushing himself harder. He burst into a small clearing and spotted a sturdy-looking tree. Without hesitation, Greg leapt for the lowest branch, hauling himself up with desperate strength. The bear arrived seconds later, circling the tree and standing on its hind legs. Its claws raked the bark, leaving deep gouges. Greg climbed higher, heart pounding. "Stay back!" he yelled, voice cracking. From his perch, Greg surveyed his surroundings. The dense forest stretched in all directions, no signs of civilization visible. He was alone with the bear. Hours passed. The bear remained vigilant, occasionally attempting to climb. Greg's muscles screamed from the strain of holding on. As dusk approached, Greg heard a crack. The branch beneath him gave way. He grasped frantically for another handhold, but gravity won out. With a sickening lurch, he plummeted towards the waiting bear below. Greg crashed to the ground, the bear immediately upon him. Sharp claws tore into his leg, eliciting an agonized scream. Adrenaline surged as Greg instinctively fought back, striking the bear's snout with his fist. The bear recoiled momentarily, giving Greg a chance to scramble backwards. He frantically searched for a weapon, grabbing his fishing rod lying nearby. "Get back!" Greg yelled, swinging the rod at the advancing bear. The thin carbon fiber made contact but barely fazed the animal. With a roar, the bear lunged again, its massive paw swiping across Greg's chest. Claws ripped through his jacket and skin, drawing blood. Greg's vision blurred from pain and fear. He continued swinging the rod, desperately trying to keep the bear at bay. But each movement sent waves of agony through his body. The bear's jaws snapped inches from Greg's face. He could smell its hot breath, see the yellowed teeth that threatened to end his life. In a last-ditch effort, Greg jammed the rod into the bear's mouth. The animal thrashed, trying to dislodge the foreign object. Its claws raked Greg's arms as he held on, refusing to let go despite the excruciating pain. Suddenly, the world began to fade. Greg's grip on the rod loosened as consciousness slipped away. His last thought before blackness took him was a prayer that death would be quick. When Greg's eyes fluttered open, he was alone. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the gentle rustle of leaves. Disoriented and in shock, he tried to sit up, only to be overwhelmed by searing pain. "Help!" he croaked, voice barely above a whisper. Greg assessed his injuries, fighting waves of nausea. His leg was a mangled mess of flesh and denim. His chest and arms bore deep gashes, blood seeping through his tattered clothes. The bear was gone, but Greg knew he wasn't safe. He needed help and fast. With trembling hands, he reached for his phone, praying it had survived the attack. Greg assessed his wounds, stemming the bleeding with torn clothing. He fumbled for his phone, finding it damaged but functional. Dialing 911, he heard only static. "No signal," he muttered, despair setting in. A rustling nearby made Greg freeze. Fear gripped him as he recognized the sound of a bear. He dragged himself under a fallen log, biting back cries of pain. The bear's snuffling grew closer. Greg held his breath, praying it wouldn't detect him. After agonizing minutes, the sounds receded. Night fell, bringing a sharp drop in temperature. Greg shivered violently, his wet clothes offering little protection. He fought to stay awake, knowing sleep could mean death from hypothermia or blood loss. "Stay awake," he repeated, a mantra against encroaching darkness. Greg's thoughts turned to his family. Would he see them again? The possibility of dying alone in the wilderness overwhelmed him. As hours crawled by, Greg's condition worsened. Fever set in, clouding his mind. He hallucinated rescue teams, only to have hope crushed by reality. Dawn broke, bringing no relief. Greg's strength was fading fast. He needed help soon, or his survival story would end here in the unforgiving wilderness. As the sun climbed higher in the Montana sky, the tranquility of Flathead National Forest was shattered by the whir of helicopter blades. Park Ranger Sarah Collins leaned out of the chopper, her eyes scanning the vast expanse of green below. "Any sign of him?" she shouted over the noise to her colleague, Mark Tanner. Mark shook his head, frustration evident on his face. "Nothing yet. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack." The search for Greg Daniels had begun early that morning when his wife, unable to reach him, called the ranger station in a panic. Greg was an experienced outdoorsman, she'd said, and it wasn't like him to be out of contact for so long. On the ground, a team of search and rescue volunteers combed through the dense underbrush along the Flathead River. Among them was local guide Jake Peterson, his trusted bloodhound, Rusty, leading the way. "Come on, boy," Jake encouraged, watching Rusty sniff the air intently. "Find him." Back at the ranger station, Ranger Collins' partner, David Sean, coordinated the search efforts. His radio crackled to life. "Base, this is Team 2. We've located Daniel's vehicle at the River Bend trailhead." "Answer." David's pulse quickened. "Copy that, Team 2. Secure the area and begin your search from there. I'll redirect air support to your location." He quickly relayed the information to Sarah in the helicopter. Within minutes, the chopper changed course, heading towards the newly discovered starting point. As they approached the trailhead, Sarah spotted Greg's battered pickup truck in the small parking area. "There's his car," she pointed out to Mark. "Set us down nearby." The helicopter landed in a clearing close to the trailhead. Sarah and Mark jumped out, ducking under the still-spinning rotors. They jogged over to the truck, where Team 2 was already at work. "Any signs of a struggle?" Sarah asked the team leader. He shook his head. "Nothing obvious. Looks like he parked, grabbed his gear, and headed out. Normal start to a fishing trip." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. "Okay, let's fan out from here. He couldn't have gone too far if he was just fishing." As the team began to move out, Jake and Rusty arrived at the scene. The bloodhound immediately picked up a scent from Greg's vehicle and began to pull on his leash, eager to follow the trail. "Looks like Rusty's got something," Jake called out. "We'll take point." Sarah gave him a thumbs up. "Lead the way. We'll follow." The search party moved into the forest, following the eager bloodhound. The dense undergrowth made progress slow, but Rusty seemed confident in the trail he was following. After about an hour of trekking, Rusty suddenly stopped, his tail going stiff. Jake knelt beside him, noticing something on the ground. "Hold up," he shouted to the others. "I've got something here." Sarah rushed over, her heart pounding. Jake pointed to a small patch of disturbed earth. There, partially hidden by leaves, was a scrap of fabric and traces of what looked disturbingly like blood. "Oh no," Sarah breathed, her worst fears starting to materialize. Mark joined them, his face grim. "That's not a good sign." Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. "All right, we're no longer just looking for a lost hiker. This is now potentially an injury situation, possibly worse." She couldn't bring herself to say the word fatality out loud. She turned to the team. "I want everyone on high alert. Look for any signs of a struggle, more blood, or animal tracks." The possibility of a bear attack hung unspoken in the air. Jake let Rusty smell the bloodied fabric, and the dogs set off again with renewed vigor. The search party followed, a tense silence falling over them. As they pressed deeper into the forest, signs of disturbance became more frequent. Broken branches, scuff marks on trees, and more troublingly, larger patches of blood. "It looks like he was running from something," Mark observed, his voice low. Sarah nodded, her face pale. "And whatever it was, he caught up with him." Suddenly, Rusty let out a loud bark, pulling Jake forward with such force that he nearly lost his grip on the leash. "Hugh's got something," Jake yelled. The team rushed forward, breaking through a thicket into a small clearing. There, huddled beneath the fallen log, was a figure. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. "Greg? Greg Daniels." The figure stirred weakly, a low moan escaping his lips. "We've found him," Sarah shouted into her radio. "We need immediate medical evac at our location." As the team rushed to Greg's aid, Sarah caught sight of deep claw marks on his body and the surrounding trees. Her suspicions were confirmed. This had been a bear attack. "Hang in there, Greg," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "Help is on the way." The sound of an approaching helicopter filled the air. As Sarah looked up at the sky, a mix of relief and concern washed over her. They had found Greg Daniels, but his ordeal was far from over. The real challenge, keeping him alive until they could get him to a hospital, was just beginning. The whir of helicopter blades grew louder as the medical evacuation team approached. Sarah Collins knelt beside Greg, her hands applying pressure to the worst of his wounds. "Stay with us, Greg," she urged, noting his pallid complexion and labored breathing. "Help is almost here." Greg's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with pain. "There," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "We know," Sarah assured him. "You're safe now. We're going to get you out of here." The helicopter touched down in a nearby clearing, its downdraft whipping through the trees. Two paramedics rushed towards them, medical kits in hand. "What's his status?" The lead paramedic, a woman named Emily, shouted over the noise. Sarah quickly briefed them. "Male, mid-40s, victim of a bear attack. Multiple lacerations and possible fractures. He's been out here for at least 24 hours. Emily nodded, kneeling to assess Greg. "Sarah, can you hear me? I'm Emily, a paramedic. We're here to help you." Greg managed a weak nod, grimacing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body. The paramedics worked swiftly, cutting away Greg's tattered clothing to reveal the full extent of his injuries. Sarah and her team stepped back, allowing them room to work. "Jesus," Mark muttered, taking in the deep gashes across Greg's chest and arms. "He's lucky to be alive." Emily called out vitals as her partner prepared for lines. "BP 80 over 50, pulse 120 and thready. He's in hypovolemic S. Hoc." They started 2 large-bore IVs, fluids running wide open. Emily administered morphine for pain relief, then began cleaning and dressing the wounds. "We need to move him," Emily announced after stabilizing Greg as best they could in the field. "He needs a trauma center fast." The team carefully lifted Greg onto a backboard, securing him for transport. As they carried him towards the helicopter, Greg stirred again. "My wife," he whispered. Sarah leaned in close. "Don't worry, Greg. We'll contact your family. Just focus on staying strong. Okay?" Greg managed a weak smile before closing his eyes again. The helicopter lifted off, carrying Greg and the paramedics. Sarah watched it disappear over the treetops, then turned to her team. "All right, folks. Great work today, but we're not done yet. We need to secure this area for the investigation." Jake, the local guide, spoke up. "What about the bear? Could still be in the area." Sarah nodded grimly. "Good point. We'll need to coordinate with fish and wildlife. In the meantime, everyone stays in groups of 3 or more. No one goes anywhere alone." As the team began documenting the scene, Sarah noticed something glinting in the underbrush. She carefully made her way over, Mark following close behind. "What is it?" he asked as Sarah knelt down. She reached out, pushing aside some leaves to reveal a tuft of coarse, dark fur caught on a broken branch. Next to it lay several strands of what looked like fishing line. "Evidence," Sarah replied, her voice tight. "Looks like bear hair, and this must be from Greg's fishing rod." Mark whistled low. "Poor guy never stood a chance." Sarah bagged the samples carefully. "These will help the investigation. We need to understand exactly what happened here." As they continued to calm the area, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. They found Greg's backpack, torn open and the contents scattered. His bear spray lay unused several yards away, likely knocked from his hand during the initial encounter. Sarah's radio crackled to life. "Ranger Collins, this is Base. Do you copy?" "Collins here. Go ahead." "Base. We've got an update on Greg Daniels. He's arrived at Kalispell Regional Medical Center. He's in critical condition, but stable for now." A collective sigh of relief went through the team. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Copy that, Base. Thanks for the update." As the day wore on, fish and wildlife officers arrived to assist with the investigation. They set up trail cameras and hair snares, hoping to identify and possibly track the bear involved in the attack. "What are the chances you'll find it?" Sarah asked one of the officers. He shrugged. "Hard to say. Bears can cover a lot of ground, especially if they're spooked. But if it's still in the area, we'll do our best to locate it." As the sun began to set, Sarah called her team together. "All right, everyone. We've done all we can for today. Tomorrow, we'll continue the investigation and start putting together our official report. For now, let's head back to base." The team trudged back through the forest, the events of the day weighing heavily on their minds. The beauty of the wilderness around them now seemed tinged with danger, a stark reminder of nature's power and unpredictability. Back at the ranger station, Sarah began the process of writing up her preliminary report. She paused, staring at the blank form on her computer screen, the cursor blinking steadily. How do you summarize a day like this? She wondered. How do you capture the terror Greg must have felt, the race against time to find him, the collective relief when he was found alive? With a deep breath, she began to type. On June 15th, at approximately 0900 hours, Flathead National Forest Rangers received a report of a missing hiker identified as Greg Daniels. As she wrote, Sarah knew that this incident would stay with her for a long time. It was a powerful reminder of why she had become a ranger in the first place, to help people enjoy the wilderness safely, and to be there when things went wrong. Outside her office window, the Montana night was settling in, stars twinkling in the vast sky. Somewhere out there, a bear was roaming free, unaware of the chaos it had caused. And in a hospital room in Kalispell, Greg Daniels was fighting for his life, forever changed by his encounter with the wild. The rescue was over, but the story was far from finished. The steady beep of heart monitors filled the sterile air of the intensive care unit at Kalispell Regional Medical Center. Greg Daniels lay motionless, his body a patchwork of bandages and tubes. His wife, Linda, sat beside him, her hand gently resting on his. Dr. Amelia Chong entered the room, clipboard in hand. Linda looked up, hope and fear mingling in her tired eyes. "How is he, doctor?" Linda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Chong offered a reassuring smile. "Be stable, Mrs. Daniels. Your husband is a fighter." She moved to the foot of the bed, reviewing Greg's chart. "The surgery went well. We've repaired the major lacerations and set the fractured bones in his left arm and leg. The next 48 hours will be critical, but I'm cautiously optimistic." Linda nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "When will he wake up?" "We're keeping him sedated for now to manage the pain and give his body a chance to start healing," Dr. Chong explained. "We'll begin to reduce the sedation tomorrow and see how he responds." As if on cue, Greg stirred slightly, a low moan escaping his lips. Linda leaned forward, squeezing his hand. "Greg? Honey, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain and confusion. "Linda?" he croaked, his voice hoarse. Dr. Chong moved quickly to Greg's side, checking his vitals. "Mr. Daniels, you're in the hospital. You're safe now. Try not to move too much." Greg's eyes darted around the room, panic rising in his face. "The bear? Where's the bear?" "Shell, it's okay," Linda soothed, stroking his hair. "The bear is gone. You're safe here." Dr. Chong adjusted Greg's medication, and soon he drifted back into a drug-induced sleep. She turned to Linda, her expression serious. "Mrs. Daniels, I need to prepare you. The physical recovery will be challenging, but it's the psychological impact we're most concerned about. Bear attack survivors often experience severe PTSD." Linda nodded, her face pale. "What can we do?" "We'll have our trauma counselor visit once Greg is more lucid. In the meantime, just being here, providing a calm, reassuring presence, is the best thing you can do." Over the next few days, Greg's condition slowly improved. The sedation was gradually reduced, allowing him longer periods of consciousness. Each time he woke, the memories of the attack came flooding back, leaving him agitated and fearful. On the fourth day, Greg was moved out of the ICU into a private room. His children, Alex and Sarah, were finally allowed to visit. They entered the room hesitantly, shocked by their father's appearance. Dad, Alex, the older of the two at 17, approached the bed cautiously. Greg managed a weak smile. "Hey kiddo, sorry I missed your baseball game." Sarah, 14, burst into tears, rushing to hug her father before Linda could stop her. Greg winced but didn't push her away, instead wrapping his good arm around her. "Easy there, sweetheart," he murmured, dance a bit sore. As the family reunited, Dr. Chong entered with a man in civilian clothes. "Mr. Daniels, this is Dr. Marcus Reed, our trauma counselor. He'd like to speak with you if you're feeling up to it." Greg nodded warily. Linda ushered the kids out, promising to bring them back later. Dr. Reed pulled up a chair, his manner calm and unhurried. "Hello, Greg. How are you feeling today?" Greg let out a humorless chuckle. "Like I went 10 rounds with a bear and lost." "That's understandable," Dr. Reed nodded. "Can you tell me about what happened?" Greg closed his eyes, his heart rate increasing as the memories surfaced. "I was fishing. The bear came out of nowhere. I ran. Water was so fast." His breathing became rapid, sweat beading on his forehead. Dr. Reed leaned forward, his voice steady. "You're safe now, Greg. The bear isn't here. Focus on my voice. Can you tell me 5 things you can see in this room?" Greg opened his eyes, forcing himself to focus. The TV, the window, my water glass, your tie, the clock on the wall." "Good," Dr. Reed encouraged. "Now 4 things you can touch. They continued the grounding exercise until Greg's breathing normalized. Dr. Reed smiled encouragingly. "Well done, Greg. What you just experienced is a common reaction to trauma. We're going to work on techniques to help you manage these episodes." Over the next few weeks, Greg's physical recovery progressed. The bandages came off, revealing angry red scars that would forever map the bear's attack on his body. He began physical therapy, pushing through the pain to regain strength and mobility. But the psychological scars ran deeper. Nightmares plagued his sleep, leaving him exhausted and irritable. The sound of rustling leaves or an unexpected movement could trigger a panic attack. During one particularly difficult therapy session, Greg broke down. "I don't know if I can do this, Doc," he admitted to Dr. Reed. "Every time I close my eyes, on back's air, I can smell the bear's breath, feel its claws." Dr. Reed nodded sympathetically. "Recovery isn't linear, Greg. You've been through a traumatic experience. It's going to take time to process and heal, but you're making progress, even if it doesn't always feel like it." As the days turned into weeks, Greg slowly began to improve. The panic attacks became less frequent, the nightmares less vivid. He found solace in talking with other survivors of animal attacks, their shared experiences helping him feel less alone. 6 weeks after the attack, Dr. Chong gave Greg the news he'd been waiting for. "You're ready to go home, Mr. Daniels. Your physical recovery is progressing well, and I believe you'll heal better in familiar surroundings." Greg felt a mix of relief and apprehension. "What about, the other stuff?" he asked, tapping his temple. Dr. Chung smiled reassuringly. "Dr. Reed has arranged for you to continue therapy as an outpatient. Remember, healing takes time, both for your body and your mind." As Linda helped him pack his belongings, Greg paused, looking out the hospital window. The mountains loomed in the distance, beautiful and imposing. Once, they had been his playground, a source of adventure and peace. Now, they filled him with a complex mix of emotions: fear, respect, longing. "You okay, honey?" Linda asked, noticing his distant expression. Greg turned to her, managing a small smile. "Yeah, I think I will be. This is gonna be a long road. Fine. I'm Elise. I made it out. That's something, right?" Linda wrapped her arms around him gently, mindful of his still healing wounds. "It's everything," she whispered. As they left the hospital, Greg knew his recovery was far from over. The bear had taken more than just flesh, it had stolen his sense of security, his carefree love of the outdoors. But with each step, each day, he was reclaiming pieces of himself. The wilderness had nearly killed him, but Greg was determined not to let it defeat him. Somehow, someway, he would find his way back not just to health, but to the man he used to be. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks office as senior wildlife biologist Dr. Evelyn Reeves arrived. She found her colleague, Conservation Officer Mike Hawkins, already poring over maps and reports. "Morning, Mike," Evelyn greeted, setting down her coffee. "Ready to dive into this bear attack case?" Mike looked up, his face edged with concern. "Morning, Ez. Yeah, I've been reviewing the initial reports. It's not looking good for our furry friend out there." Evelyn nodded grimly. She understood the gravity of the situation. Bear attacks, while rare, always stirred up public concern and often led to calls for drastic measures. "Let's start from the beginning," she said, pulling up a chair. "What do we know?" Mike spread out photos from the attack site. Victim is Greg Daniels, 45-year-old experienced fisherman. He was fly fishing along the Flathead River when he encountered a black bear. The attack occurred approximately 2 miles from the River Bend trailhead. Evelyn examined the photos, her trained eye picking out details. These claw marks on the trees. Definitely a black bear. And look at the size of these paw prints. We're dealing with a large male, probably 300 pounds or more. Mike nodded in agreement. Rangers found tufts of black fur at the scene. DNA analysis confirmed it's from an American black bear, Ursus americanus. Any history of problem bears in this area? Evelyn asked, making notes. Mike shook his head. Nothing significant. A few reports of bears raiding campsites earlier in the season, but that's not uncommon. This level of aggression is unusual. Evelyn frowned, her mind working through possibilities. Could be a bear protecting a food cache, or maybe it was surprised and felt threatened. We need more information about the moments leading up to the attack. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Ranger Sarah Collins entered, carrying a file. Dr. Reeves, Officer Hawkins. She greeted them. I've got Greg Daniels' statement from the hospital. Thought you'd want to see it right away. Evelyn took the file, spreading its contents on the table. Thanks, Sarah. This could help fill in some blanks. The three of them huddled around the statement, reading Greg's account of the attack. Evelyn's frown deepened as she absorbed the details. He says he saw the bear across the river initially, but it seemed uninterested in him, she mused. It only charged after he caught a fish and called out in excitement. Mike nodded thoughtfully. Could have triggered a predatory response. The bear might have associated the noise with an easy meal. Sarah pointed to another section of the report. Daniels mentioned he had bear spray but couldn't reach it in time. It was found and used at the scene. Evelyn sighed, running a hand through her hair. A series of unfortunate events. The bear was likely just behaving on instinct, but now we have a public safety issue on our hands. Mike leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. You know what this means, Ev. There's going to be pressure to put this bear down. Evelyn nodded slowly. She'd been dreading this part. As a wildlife biologist, her mission was to protect and preserve Montana's wildlife, but she also understood the need to ensure public safety. Let's not jump to conclusions, she said firmly. We need to gather more data. Sarah, has your team set up trail cameras and hair snares in the area? Sarah nodded. Yes, we've got a grid set up covering about a 5-mile radius from the attack site. If the bear's still in the area, we should be able to track its movements. Could, Evelyn replied. Might. I want you to coordinate with local hunting groups and outdoor organizations. We need to get the word out about increased bear activity in the area. Emphasize the importance of carrying bear spray and making noise on the trails. Mike jotted down notes. Got it. I'll also increase patrols in the area, especially around popular fishing spots. Evelyn stood, her mind made up. I'm going to head out to the attack site. I want to see it for myself. Get a feel for the terrain and any environmental factors that might have contributed to this incident. A few hours later, Evelyn found herself standing at the edge of the Flathead River, the rushing water a constant backdrop to her thoughts. She knelt, examining the trampled undergrowth where Greg had fought for his life. What were you thinking, big guy? She murmured, her eyes scanning the treeline. What made you break your usual patterns? As she worked, taking samples and measurements, Evelyn's radio crackled to life. Dr. Reeves, this is base. We've got movement on one of the trail cameras. Looks like your bear. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Copy that. Send me the coordinates. I'm heading there now. She packed up her gear quickly and set off, her steps swift but cautious. As she neared the location, she slowed, all her senses on high alert. Then she saw it. Through a gap in the trees, about 50 yards away, a large black bear was foraging, unaware of her presence. Evelyn raised her binoculars, studying the animal carefully. There you are, she whispered. The bear was indeed large, its black coat glossy in the dappled sunlight. As it turned, Evelyn caught sight of a distinctive scar across its muzzle. This had to be the bear from the attack. She watched it for several minutes, noting its behavior. The bear seemed calm, displaying no signs of aggression or unusual behavior. It was simply doing what bears do, searching for food. Evelyn's radio chirped softly. "Dr. Reeves, check in please. Have you located the bear?" She kept her voice low as she responded. "Affirmative. I have visual confirmation. It's definitely our guy. Sending coordinates now." Back at the office, Evelyn, Mike, and Sarah gathered to discuss their findings. The atmosphere was tense, all of them aware of the weight of the decision before them. "The DNA from the hair samples at the attack site matches the samples from our trail cameras," Evelyn began. "We can say with certainty that this is the bear involved in the Daniels attack." Mike leaned forward, his face serious. "The public's getting nervous, Ev. Why in bear country?" "Emphasize the importance of carrying bear spray and making noise on trails." Sarah looked thoughtful. "We could also implement temporary closures in the immediate area while we conduct the aversive conditioning. Show the public we're taking active steps." Evelyn felt a glimmer of hope. "Exactly. We're not ignoring the problem. We're addressing it in a way that prioritizes both public safety and wildlife conservation." Mike stood, his decision made. "All richt, Ev. I'm on board. But we'll need to move fast. Draft up a detailed plan, and I'll present it to the director this afternoon." The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. Evelyn and her team implemented their aversive conditioning plan, tracking the bear's movements and setting up strategic interventions. Each time the bear approached areas frequented by humans, they were ready with their arsenal of non-lethal deterrence. Simultaneously, Mike led a robust public education campaign. They held town halls, distributed informational pamphlets, and even created a social media campaign about bear safety. As the month drew to a close, Evelyn found herself once again standing before the director's desk, delivering her final report. "The aversive conditioning has been successful," she explained, pointing to a map dotted with color-coded markers. "Our target bear has shown a marked decrease in approaches to human-occupied areas. Its movement patterns have shifted, indicating a learned avoidance of the zones we've conditioned." The director nodded, looking impressed. "And public response?" Mike stepped in, generally positive. There was some initial skepticism, but as people have seen our active presence in the field and learned more about bear behavior, support has grown. The education programs have been particularly well received. The director leaned back, a small smile on his face. "Well done, both of you. This could serve as a model for future wildlife conflict management." As they left the office, Evelyn felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They had found a balance, a way to protect both the public and the wildlife they were charged with managing. "We did it, Mike," she said, unable to keep the relief from her voice. Mike clapped her on the shoulder. "We did. But our work's not done. We need to keep monitoring, keep educating." Evelyn nodded, her resolve firm. "Absolutely. But today, I think we can call this a win for the people of Montana, and for one very lucky bear." As the sun set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest, somewhere in the wilds of Flathead National Forest, a large black bear foraged peacefully. Unaware of the controversy it had caused, the plans made, the lessons learned, it simply went about its bearish business. And for now, at least, that was exactly as it should be. 6 months had passed since the bear attack that had nearly claimed Greg Daniels' life. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine and fallen leaves as Greg stood at the edge of the Flathead River, his eyes fixed on the rushing water. He took a deep breath, feeling the pull of old scars beneath his jacket. "You okay, honey?" Linda's voice was soft, concern evident in her tone. Greg turned to his wife, managing a small smile. "Yeah, I think so. It's just strange being back here." Linda squeezed his hand, her presence a steady anchor. "We can leave if it's too much." Greg shook his head. "No, I need to do this. Dr. Reed said it's an important part of the healing process." As if on cue, Dr. Marcus Reed approached from where he'd been standing a respectful distance away. How are you feeling, Greg? Greg took another deep breath, considering the question. Nervous, scared, but also determined, I guess. Dr. Reed nodded encouragingly. That's completely normal. Remember, we're not here to push you beyond your limits. This is about facing your fears at your own pace. Greg nodded, his gaze returning to the river. The scene was hauntingly familiar, the rushing water, the dense forest beyond. Yet everything felt different. It was different. I keep expecting to see it, Greg admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. To bear. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves. Dr. Reed stepped closer, his voice calm and steady. That's your body's alert system working overtime, is trying to protect you. But remember what we've practiced, acknowledge the fear, but don't let it control you. Greg nodded, closing his eyes briefly. He focused on his breathing just as he'd learned in therapy. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slowly, he felt the edge of panic begin to recede. I'd like to try walking along the bank, Greg said, opening his eyes. Just a little way. Linda looked worried, but Dr. Reed gave an approving nod. That's a great idea, Greg. We'll be right beside you. The three set off, their steps slow and measured. Greg's hand never left Linda's, and he found himself scanning the tree line constantly. But with each step, he felt a small measure of confidence returning. They had gone about a quarter mile when Greg suddenly stopped. Linda felt him tense beside her. Greg, what is it? He pointed to a fallen log near the water's edge. Dense. That's where it happened. Where the bear. His breathing quickened, memories flooding back. The bear's hot breath, the searing pain of claws ripping through flesh, the certainty that he was going to die. Dr. Reed's voice cut through the rising panic. Stay with us, Greg. Focus on the present. What do you see right now? Greg blinked, forcing himself to really look at his surroundings. The log, the river, some late wildflowers. Can't, Dr. Reed encouraged. What do you hear? The water, wind in the trees, a bird, a woodpecker, I think. As Greg continued to list the sensory details around him, he felt the panic begin to subside. The memories were still there, but they no longer overwhelmed him. I want to sit for a minute, Greg said, gesturing to a large rock near the water. As they settled onto the rock, Linda wrapped an arm around Greg's waist. I'm so proud of you, she murmured. Greg leaned into her embrace, feeling a mix of exhaustion and accomplishment. They sat in silence for a while, watching the river flow by. Finally, Greg spoke. I used to love it out here. The peace, the connection with nature. Now, I don't know if I'll ever feel that way again. Dr. Reed leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. It's okay if your relationship with the outdoors has changed, Greg. You've been through a traumatic experience, but that doesn't mean you can't find new ways to connect with nature, to find that peace again. Greg nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that, actually. I'm not sure I'll ever feel comfortable fishing alone again, but maybe I could volunteer with the Park Service. Help teach people about bear safety, you know? Linda's face lit up. That's a wonderful idea, honey. Dr. Reed smiled approvingly. That can be very therapeutic, Greg. Using your experience to help others, to prevent similar incidents, it can be a powerful way to reclaim your sense of control. As they made their way back to the car, Greg felt a subtle shift within himself. The fear was still there, but it no longer consumed him. He had faced this place, these memories, and he had survived. Again. A few days later, Greg found himself sitting in the office of Sarah Collins, the park ranger who had been part of his rescue. She looked up as he entered, a warm smile spreading across her face. Great. It's good to see you up and about. Please have a seat. Greg settled into the chair, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. Thanks for meeting with me, Ranger Collins. Please call me Sarah, she insisted. What can I do for you? Greg took a deep breath. I've been doing a lot of thinking since the attack, and I've realized I want to do something positive with my experience. I was wondering if there might be opportunities to volunteer, maybe help with educating people about bear safety. Sarah's eyes lit up. That's a fantastic idea, Greg. We're always looking for ways to improve our public education programs, especially when it comes to wildlife safety. Your first-hand experience could be incredibly valuable. She pulled out a folder, rifling through some papers. We actually have a series of workshops coming up next month. They're aimed at hikers and campers, teaching them how to recreate safely in bear country. Would you be interested in sharing your story as part of that? Greg felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of reliving his experience in front of an audience. But beneath that was a stronger feeling, a sense of purpose. I think I would, he said, surprising himself with the steadiness in his voice. If it could help prevent someone else from going through what I did, well, that would mean a lot. Sarah beamed. That's wonderful, Greg. I think your story could really make an impact. People often think it won't happen to me, but hearing from someone who's been through it, that can really drive the message home. They spent the next hour discussing the details of the workshop. By the time Greg left the office, he felt a sense of excitement he hadn't experienced in months. He was taking control, turning his trauma into something positive. As the day of the workshop approached, Greg found himself growing increasingly nervous. The night before, he paced the living room, unable to sit still. What if I freeze up? He asked Linda. What if I can't get through it? Linda took his hands in hers, her gaze steady and reassuring. You can do this, Greg. You're stronger than you know. And remember, Dr. Reed will be there if you need support. Greg nodded, taking a deep breath. You're right. I can do this. I need to do this. The next morning, Greg stood at the edge of a small amphitheater in Flathead National Forest. A group of about 50 hikers and campers sat on the wooden benches, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Sarah stepped up to the microphone. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to our bear safety workshop. We have a special guest with us today. Greg Daniels is going to share his experience with a bear encounter right here in our forest. Great. As Greg took the microphone, he felt a moment of panic. But then he looked out at the audience, families with young children, elderly couples, solo hikers, all of them potential victims if they weren't prepared. He found his voice. 6 months ago, I was standing not far from here, enjoying a morning of fly fishing. I never imagined it would turn into the fight of my life. As Greg recounted his story, he could see the impact it was having. People leaned forward, their expressions rapt. When he described the moment the bear attacked, several people gasped audibly. I made mistakes that day, Greg continued. I wasn't as prepared as I should have been. My bear spray was in my backpack, out of reach when I needed it most. I let my guard down, forgetting that I was a guest in the bear's territory. He went on to describe his recovery, both physical and emotional. It's been a long journey, and it's not over. But I'm here today because I want to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. Being in bear country is a privilege, but it comes with responsibilities. As Greg finished his story, the audience erupted in applause. Many had tears in their eyes. Sarah stepped back up to the microphone. Thank you, Greg. Your courage in sharing your story is truly admirable. She turned to the audience. Now, let's talk about what we can learn from Greg's experience, and the steps we can all take to stay safe in bear country. The rest of the workshop flew by. Greg demonstrated proper bear spray use, helped participants practice making noise on the trail, and answered countless questions. By the end, he felt exhausted but exhilarated. As the crowd dispersed, a young family approached Greg. The father, a man about Greg's age, held out his hand. Thank you, he said earnestly. We're new to hiking, and honestly, I was nervous about bears. But hearing your story, learning these safety techniques, it makes me feel like we can do this responsibly." Greg shook the man's hand, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "That means a lot to hear. Enjoy the trails and stay safe out there." As Greg packed up to leave, Sarah approached him. "Greg, that was incredible. The impact you had today. I can't thank you enough." Greg smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment he hadn't experienced in months. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity. It feels good to be making a difference." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then continued. "I have a proposition for you. We've been thinking about starting a more regular series of these workshops, maybe even some guided hikes focusing on wildlife awareness. Would you be interested in being more involved?" Greg felt a spark of excitement. Yes, I think I would. Feels right, you know? Using what happened to me to help others." Sarah beamed. "Fantastic. We'll work out the details, but I think this could be the start of something really important." As Greg drove home that evening, he felt a shift within himself. The scars on his body would always be there, reminders of that terrifying day. But now they felt less like wounds and more like marks of survival, of lessons learned. He thought about the bear, somewhere out in the vast Montana wilderness. Thanks to the efforts of wildlife biologists like Dr. Reeves, it had been given a second chance, just as Greg had. They were both learning to navigate a world forever changed by their encounter. Greg knew he would never be the same man he was before the attack. The carefree fisherman who ventured into the wilderness without a second thought was gone. But in his place was someone new, someone more aware, more respectful of nature's power, and more determined to make a difference. As he pulled into his driveway, Linda was waiting on the porch. She rushed to meet him as he got out of the car. "How did he go?" she asked, searching his face. Greg pulled her into a hug. "He went well," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Really well. I think I found my way back." Linda leaned back, looking into his eyes. She saw something there she hadn't seen in months. A spark, a sense of purpose. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. As they walked arm in arm into the house, Greg felt a sense of peace settle over him. The wilderness had nearly taken his life, but in facing his fears, in sharing his story, he had reclaimed something vital. He wasn't just a victim or a survivor anymore. He was a teacher, a protector, a voice for responsible coexistence with the wild. The journey wasn't over. There would still be difficult days, moments of fear and doubt. But Greg knew now that he had the strength to face them. And somewhere out in the Montana wilderness, life went on. Bears foraged, fish swam, and the great cycle of nature continued, indifferent to the dramas of human lives but forever intertwined with them. Greg Daniels, forever changed by his encounter with the wild, had found his place in that cycle. And for the first time in months, he looked to the future not with fear, but with hope. Ben Callahan squinted against the bright Alaskan sun as he stepped off the small plane onto the tarmac of Anchorage International Airport. The crisp air filled his lungs, a stark contrast to the stuffy cabin he'd endured for hours. Shouldering his camera bag, he made his way to the rental car counter. "Heading to Katmai?" the attendant asked, noticing Ben's gear. "That's right," Ben replied, signing the paperwork. "Got a date with some grizzlies." The drive to Katmai National Park was long but breathtaking. Towering mountains and vast forests stretched as far as the eye could see. Ben's excitement grew with each mile. At the park entrance, Ranger Sarah greeted him. "Mr. Callahan, we've been expecting you. Let's go over some safety protocols." Inside the ranger station, Sarah spread out a map. "You'll be camping here, near Brooks Falls. It's prime bear territory, so stay alert." Ben nodded, absorbing every detail. "Any recent bear activity I should know about?" Sarah's expression turned serious. "We've had reports of a particularly large male in the area. "You've been more aggressive than usual." "Noted," Ben said, a mix of caution and excitement in his voice. As Ben set up his tent, the sounds of the wilderness enveloped him. Distant roars echoed across the landscape, sending a shiver down his spine. That evening, he sat by his campfire, reviewing his equipment. The weight of his telephoto lens was reassuring in his hands. "Tomorrow," he whispered to himself, "we get the money shot." Sleep came fitfully, his dreams filled with massive bears and flashing cameras. Dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Ben emerged from his tent, breath visible in the cold morning air. He double-checked his gear: cameras, extra batteries, bear spray, and a satellite phone. As he hiked toward Brooks Falls, the forest came alive around him. Birds called from the treetops, and small animals scurried through the underbrush. Ben's senses were on high alert, every snapping twig making him pause. The rush of water grew louder as he approached the falls. Rounding a bend, he caught his first glimpse of the majestic scene. Several brown bears stood in the rushing water, expertly catching salmon mid-leap. Ben's camera clicked rapidly as he captured the incredible sight. Hours passed in a blur of activity, his focus entirely on framing the perfect shot. As the day wore on, Ben noticed a shift in the bears' behavior. They seemed more agitated, constantly looking over their shoulders. That's when he heard it, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the very ground. From the treeline emerged the largest bear Ben had ever seen. Its fur was a dark brown, almost black, and its muscles rippled with each step. The other bears quickly vacated the area, leaving the newcomer to dominate the fishing spot. Ben's heart raced as he raised his camera. This was the shot he'd been waiting for. Through his viewfinder, he watched the massive bear snatch a salmon from the air with shocking speed. Caught up in the moment, Ben took a step forward for a better angle. His foot came down on a dry branch, the crack echoing like a gunshot in the sudden silence. The bear's head snapped toward him, dark eyes locking onto Ben's position. Time seemed to stand still as man and beast stared at each other. "Easy now," Ben whispered, slowly reaching for his bear spray. "I'm not here to hurt you." The bear's nostrils flared, taking in Ben's scent. It let out a low, menacing growl that sent ice through Ben's veins. Suddenly, a salmon leaped from the water, breaking the tension. The bear turned its attention back to the falls, seemingly dismissing Ben as a threat. Breathing a sigh of relief, Ben began to back away slowly. His hand trembled as he lowered his camera, the adrenaline making his movements jerky. As he retreated, Ben's mind raced with possibilities. That encounter could have ended very differently. He knew he needed to be more careful, more respectful of the wilderness he was visiting. Back at his campsite, Ben reviewed his photos, marveling at the power and beauty he'd captured. The image of the massive bear, water droplets glistening on its fur, was everything he'd hoped for. That night, as he lay in his tent listening to the distant sounds of the forest, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that his adventure was just beginning. The encounter at the falls had awakened something in him, a mix of fear and fascination that would drive him deeper into bear country. Little did he know, the true test of his courage and skill was yet to come. Ben awoke before dawn, eager to capture the golden hour light. He hiked to a secluded spot near Brooks Falls, setting up his tripod with practiced ease. As the sun crested the horizon, a mother bear and two cubs emerged from the treeline. Ben's camera clicked rapidly, documenting their tender interactions. "Easy now," he whispered as the bears approached the water's edge. "Just pretend I'm not here." The cubs splashed playfully while their mother scanned for salmon. Ben's heart raced with each perfect shot. After hours of shooting, Ben decided to explore deeper into the park. He packed his gear and consulted his map, marking a route that would take him to less frequented areas. As he hiked, the forest grew denser, Ben's senses heightened, aware of every sound and movement. A twig snapped nearby, freezing him in place. A massive bull moose stepped into view, antlers swing. Ben slowly raised his camera, capturing the majestic creature before it vanished into the undergrowth. By mid-afternoon, Ben reached a clearing. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, when a distant roar echoed through the trees. His pulse quickened. "That's what I came for," he murmured, adjusting his pack. Following the sound, Ben discovered a series of trees with fresh claw marks. Some were disturbingly high up the trunks. "These must be from that big male the ranger mentioned," he mused, photographing the marks. As daylight waned, Ben set up his remote cameras near a game trail. He carefully concealed them, hoping to capture nighttime bear activity. Hiking back to camp, the hairs on Ben's neck stood up. A pungent, musky odor filled the air. He instinctively reached for his bear spray, scanning the area. Nothing appeared, but Ben quickened his pace. The smell lingered, a potent reminder of the wilderness's true owners. At his tent, Ben reviewed the day's photos. The bear family shots were stunning, but the claw marks nagged at him. Their size and height suggested an exceptionally large bear. As night fell, distant roars echoed again. Ben zipped his tent, both thrilled and unnerved by the sound. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd track those roars to their source. Little did Ben know, his pursuit of the perfect shot was leading him into the heart of danger. Ben set out at dawn, following fresh bear tracks. The forest was eerily quiet. He photographed massive paw prints, estimating the bear's size. As he ventured deeper, claw marks on trees became more frequent. Some were alarmingly high. "This bear's a monster," Ben muttered, snapping photos. A pungent odor filled the air. Ben's heartbeat quickened. He gripped his bear spray tightly. Around Dingoroki Olrup, Ben froze. A dark opening gaped in the hillside, a bear den. The stench was overwhelming. "Oh shit," he whispered, backing away slowly. A low growl rumbled from the den. Ben's blood ran cold. Suddenly, a massive grizzly emerged. Its shoulders stood as tall as Ben, muscles rippling beneath thick fur. Time slowed. Ben's finger hovered over his camera's shutter. The bear's eyes locked onto him. In that moment, Ben realized he'd made a terrible mistake. The perfect shot wasn't worth his life. As the bear rose to its full height, Ben turned and ran. Branches whipped his face as he crashed through the undergrowth. The bear's thunderous roar shook the forest. Heavy footfalls followed, gaining rapidly. Ben sprinted, limbs burning. He fumbled for his bear spray, praying it would work. The chase had begun, and Ben knew the odds were stacked against him. The massive grizzly charged at Ben, its roar shaking the forest. Ben fumbled for his bear spray, hands trembling. "Stay back," he yelled, aiming the canister. He pressed the trigger, but a gust of wind blew the spray off course. The bear, unfazed, closed in. With a powerful swipe, the grizzly tore Ben's backpack, sending equipment flying. The force knocked Ben off his feet, his camera smashing against a rock. Ben scrambled backwards, his heart pounding. The bear's hot breath hit his face as it loomed over him. "Help!" Ben screamed, knowing no one was close enough to hear. The grizzly's claws raked across Ben's leg, tearing flesh. Pain exploded through his body. As blood soaked his pants, Ben realized his life hung by a thread. The attack had only just begun, and his chances of survival were dwindling with each passing second. The grizzly's claws tore into Ben's leg, eliciting an agonized scream. Blood soaked his pants as searing pain radiated through his body. Instinct kicked in. Ben curled into a fetal position, protecting his vital organs. He forced himself to remain still, feigning death. The bear sniffed him, hot breath on Ben's neck. After what felt like an eternity, It retreated, seizing the moment, then crawled toward a nearby tree, leaving a trail of blood. His leg throbbed with each movement. "Please just leave," he whispered, tears mixing with dirt on his face. The bear's roar shattered his hope. Charged again, more aggressive than before. Ben braced himself back against the tree. The grizzly's massive form blocked out the sun as it approached, ready to deliver what could be a fatal blow. In this moment, Ben realized the true power of nature and the fragility of human life in the wilderness. Miles away at Katmai National Park headquarters, Ranger Sarah's radio crackled to life. The distress signal from Ben's satellite phone pierced the calm afternoon. "Mayday, mayday. Possible bear attack in Sector 7. The dispatcher's voice was urgent. Sarah sprang into action, her years of training kicking in. "This is Ranger Connors. I'm assembling a team now. Get the chopper ready." Within minutes, the rescue operation was underway. Sarah briefed her team as they loaded gear into park vehicles. "Listen up. We've got a wildlife photographer, Ben Callahan, who may be under bear attack. Last known location was near Grizzly Ridge. This is not a drill, people." The team nodded grimly, fully aware of the dangers they might face. As the ground team sped towards Ben's last known coordinates, the distinct thump of helicopter blades cut through the air. Pilot Mike Jennings guided the aircraft smoothly over the treetops. "Eyes sharp, folks." Mike's voice crackled over the radio. "Looking for any sign of disturbance or unusual bear activity." On the ground, Sarah led her team through dense underbrush. The scent of pine and wildflowers was suddenly overpowered by a metallic odor that made her stomach churn. "Blood," she muttered, signaling her team to be on high alert. They pushed forward, following a trail of broken branches and disturbed earth. Sarah's hand rested on her tranquilizer gun, ready for any sudden movements. Back at headquarters, tension mounted as staff coordinated the rescue effort. Maps were spread out, marking potential locations and known bear territories. "We've got movement in Sector 8, a voice called out over the radio. "Large bear spotted heading north." Sarah's pulse quickened. "That could be our culprit. Team, adjust course to intercept." As they neared the potential attack site, Sarah deployed the search dogs. The well-trained animals took off, noses to the ground, following the scent of fear and blood. Minutes felt like hours as the team pushed through the wilderness. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound could be a clue or a threat. Suddenly, one of the dogs barked sharply. Sarah rushed forward, pushing through a thicket. Her breast caught in her throat. A trail of blood stained the forest floor, leading towards a cluster of trees. "We've got a blood trail." Sarah radioed to the helicopter. "Coordinates incoming. Be ready for emergency evac." The helicopter acknowledged, circling lower as Sarah and her team cautiously approached the area. Ben Callahan," Sarah called out, her voice echoing through the trees. "National Park Service. We're here to help." Silence, then faintly a groan. "Over here," one of the team members shouted, pointing to a crumpled form half hidden behind a fallen log. Sarah rushed over, her heart pounding. Ben lay motionless, his clothes torn and bloody, but he was breathing. "Then, can you hear me?" Sarah asked, quickly assessing his injuries. "We're going to get you out of here." Ben's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and filled with pain. "To bear," he whispered. "Don't worry about that now," Sarah assured him, signaling for the medical kit. "You're safe. We've got you." As the team worked to stabilize Ben, the sound of the helicopter grew louder. Mike's voice came over the radio. "I've got a visual on your position. There's a small clearing about 50 yards north. Can you make it there for pickup?" Sarah looked at Ben's mangled leg, then at her team. "We'll make it work. Prepare for immediate evac." Carefully, they lifted Ben onto a stretcher. Every step towards the clearing was a battle against time and terrain. Suddenly, a deep roar echoed through the forest. The team froze. "Move now," Sarah ordered, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. They quickened their pace, the sound of crashing underbrush spurring them on. The bear was coming back. The clearing came into view just as the helicopter touched down. Rotors whipped the air into a frenzy as the team rushed forward. "Get him in, quick!" Mike shouted over the deafening noise. With a final burst of effort, they loaded Ben into the helicopter. Sarah jumped in beside him, her team scrambling in after. As they lifted off, Sarah caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing. The massive grizzly emerged from the trees, its roar lost in the sound of the helicopter's engine. "We made it," Sarah breathed, grasping Ben's hand as they soared over the treetops. "You're going to be okay." Ben managed a weak nod before slipping into unconsciousness. As the helicopter sped towards Anchorage, Sarah knew that while this rescue was successful, the ordeal was far from over. The wilderness had reminded them once again of its raw, unforgiving power and the delicate balance between man and nature in this untamed land. The rhythmic thump of the helicopter blades filled the air as they raced towards Anchorage. Inside, Ben Callahan lay unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. Ranger Sarah Connors pressed gauze against his wounds, her hands steady despite the turbulence. "How's he doing?" Pilot Mike Jennings called over his shoulder, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Not good," Sarah replied grimly. "We need to move faster. He's losing a lot of blood." As if on cue, Ben's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and filled with pain. "The bear," he mumbled, trying to sit up. Sarah gently pushed him back down. "Easy, Ben. You're safe now. We're taking you to the hospital." Ben's eyes widened with sudden realization. "My camera, my footage." "Don't worry about that now," Sarah soothed. "We need to focus on getting you help." Ben's head lolled to the side as he slipped back into unconsciousness. Sarah checked his pulse, her brow furrowing with concern. "Mike, what's our ETA?" she called to the pilot. 20 minutes out," he responded. "I've radioed ahead. Emergency services will be waiting for us." Sarah nodded, turning her attention back to Ben. His face was pale, a stark contrast to the angry red gashes that marred his skin. She silently willed the helicopter to fly faster. Meanwhile, back at the attack site, the rest of the rescue team was securing the area. Ranger Tom Holloway, Sarah's second-in-command, surveyed the scene with a grim expression. "Jesus," he muttered, taking in the blood-stained ground and scattered equipment. "That bear really did a number on him." His radio crackled to life. "Tom, this is base. Any sign of the bear?" Tom scanned the tree-line, his hand resting on his tranquilizer gun. "Negative, base, but we're staying alert. This big boy could still be in the area." As if summoned by his words, a low growl emanated from the dense underbrush. The team froze, eyes wide. "Nobody move," Tom whispered, slowly raising his gun. The bushes parted, and the massive grizzly emerged. Its fur was matted with blood, some its own, some Ben's. It stood on its hind legs, towering over the rangers, its roar shaking the very ground beneath their feet. "Fire!" Tom yelled, squeezing the trigger of his tranquilizer gun. The dart found its mark, burying itself in the bear's thick hide, but the massive animal barely seemed to notice. It dropped to all fours and charged. The team scattered, diving for cover. Tom fired again and again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bear's steps began to falter. It swayed on its feet, letting out one final, defiant roar before collapsing to the ground with a heavy thud. Tom approached cautiously, his heart pounding. The bear's chest rose and fell slowly. It was alive, but sedated. Base, this is Holloway. He radioed, his voice shaky. Bear is down. I repeat, Bear is down. Requesting immediate assistance for tagging and relocation. As the team worked to secure the area, the helicopter carrying Ben neared Anchorage. The city skyline came into view, a welcome sight after the harrowing events in the wilderness. 2 minutes out, Mike announced. Emergency services are standing by. Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on Ben's pale face. Hang in there, Ben, she murmured. We're almost there. The helicopter touched down on the hospital's helipad with practiced precision. A team of doctors and nurses rushed forward, ready to take over Ben's care. Male, mid-30s, severe lacerations and potential internal injuries from a grizzly bear attack, Sarah reported as they transferred Ben to a gurney. He's been in and out of consciousness. Blood loss is significant. The medical team whisked Ben away, leaving Sarah standing on the helipad, her clothes stained with his blood. She watched as they disappeared into the building, silently praying that they weren't too late. Inside the emergency room, doctors worked frantically to stabilize Ben. His injuries were severe, deep gashes across his legs and torso, potential internal bleeding, and signs of shock. BP's dropping, a nurse called out. We're losing him. The lead doctor barked orders, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Push another unit of ONEG. We need to get this bleeding under control. Minutes stretched into hours as the medical team fought to save Ben's life. Outside in the waiting room, Sarah paced anxiously, unable to sit still. Her phone buzzed, a message from Tom. Bear secured and relocated. Area clear. How's the photographer? Sarah typed back a quick response. Still in surgery. It's touch and go. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hospital grounds, a doctor finally emerged from the operating room. Sarah stood up, her heart in her throat. Ranger Connors? The doctor asked, his face unreadable. Sarah nodded, bracing herself for news, good or bad. Mr. Callahan made it through surgery, the doctor said, a small smile breaking through his professional demeanor. It was touch and go for a while, but he's stable now. He's got a long recovery ahead, but he's alive. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Thank you, doctor. And I see him. He's in recovery now. Give it a couple of hours and you can visit briefly. He'll be pretty out of it from the anesthesia and pain medication. Sarah nodded, sinking back into her chair as the doctor left. She pulled out her phone to update her team and Ben's family. As she typed out the messages, the events of the day replayed in her mind. The frantic search, the horrifying scene they discovered, the race against time to get Ben to safety. And through it all, the looming presence of the bear, a reminder of the raw, untamed power of the wilderness. Sarah knew that while Ben had survived, his ordeal was far from over. The physical wounds would heal, but the psychological scars of such a traumatic event could last a lifetime. As night fell over Anchorage, Sarah settled in for a long vigil. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, investigating the attack, dealing with the media, and helping Ben begin his long journey to recovery. But for now, in the quiet of the hospital waiting room, she allowed herself a moment of relief. They had faced nature at its most fierce and unforgiving, and they had survived to tell the tale. The steady beep of medical equipment filled the sterile hospital room as Ben Callahan slowly regained consciousness. His eyelids fluttered open, the harsh fluorescent lights momentarily blinding him. As his vision cleared, he became aware of a dull, throbbing pain throughout his body. Where am I? Ben croaked, his throat dry and raw. A nurse quickly approached his bedside. Mr. Callahan, you're in Anchorage General Hospital. You've been through quite an ordeal. How are you feeling? Ben tried to sit up but winced in pain. Like I've been hit by a truck, she mumbled. To Bear. What happened? Easy now, the nurse soothed, gently easing him back onto the pillows. You're safe. The park rangers rescued you. Do you remember anything? Flashes of the attack raced through Ben's mind. The bear's roar, the searing pain, the overwhelming fear. He shuddered, closing his eyes tightly. I remember the bear. Came out of nowhere. I tried to run. But his voice trailed off, the memories too intense. The nurse nodded sympathetically. It's okay. You don't have to talk about it now. The doctor will be in shortly to check on you, and there are some park officials who'd like to speak with you when you're up to it. As if on cue, Dr. Simmons entered the room, followed by Ranger Sarah Connors. The doctor began checking Ben's vitals while Sarah hung back, giving them space. Mr. Callahan, Dr. Simmons began, I'm glad to see you awake. You've been through extensive surgery to repair the damage from the bear attack. You're stable now, but you have a long recovery ahead of you. Ben nodded weakly, trying to absorb the information. How bad is it, Doc? Dr. Simmons' expression turned serious. You sustained deep lacerations to your left leg and torso. There was significant muscle and tissue damage, and you lost a lot of blood. We've managed to repair most of the damage, but you'll need intensive physical therapy to regain full use of your leg. The gravity of the situation hit Ben like a ton of bricks. He closed his eyes, fighting back tears. Will I be able to hike again? To do my job? With time and dedication to your recovery? Yes, Dr. Simmons assured him. But it won't be easy and it won't be quick. You're looking at several months of rehabilitation at minimum. Ben let out a shaky breath, nodding his understanding. Dr. Simmons patted his shoulder gently before turning to leave. Get some rest, Mr. Callahan. We'll talk more about your recovery plan later. As the doctor left, Ranger Sarah stepped forward. Hello, Ben. I'm Ranger Sarah Connors. My team and I were responsible for your rescue. How are you holding up? Ben managed a weak smile. I've been better, but I guess I should be thankful I'm alive at all. Thank you for saving me. Sarah pulled up a chair beside the bed. You're welcome. But now, I hate to do this so soon, but I need to ask you some questions about what happened. It's important for our incident report and to help prevent future attacks. Are you up for that? Ben nodded, steeling himself. Yeah, I can try. Over the next hour, Ben recounted the events leading up to the attack. He described his photography plans, the signs of bear activity he'd noticed, and his fatal mistake of getting too close to the den. I should have known better, Ben said, his voice heavy with regret. I got too caught up in getting the perfect shot. I forgot that I was in their territory, not mine. Sarah listened intently, taking notes. Don't be too hard on yourself, Ben. Even experienced outdoorsmen can make mistakes. The important thing is that you survived, and we can learn from this. As they finished the interview, a commotion outside the room caught their attention. Raised voices could be heard in the hallway. I don't care about your procedures. That's my son in there. A woman's voice cried out. Ben's eyes widened. Nam, he called out weakly. The door burst open, and Ben's parents rushed in, faces edged with worry and relief. Oh, Ben, his mother exclaimed, hurrying to his bedside. She gently took his hand, tears streaming down her face. We were so worried when we got the call. His father stood at the foot of the bed, his usual stoic demeanor cracking with emotion. Son, you gave us quite a scare. Ben felt a lump form in his throat. I'm sorry, he whispered. I didn't mean to worry you. Sarah quietly excused herself, giving the family privacy for their reunion. As she left the room, she could hear Ben's mother fussing over him, his father asking about his condition, and Ben's tired but relieved responses. In the hallway, Sarah met with her superior, Park Superintendent John Hawkins. His face was grim as he greeted her. How's our photographer doing? He asked, He's awake and coherent, Sarah reported. I've gotten his statement for the incident report. It's pretty much as we suspected. He got too close to a den site. Hawkins nodded, his brow furrowed. This is going to be a media circus, you know. A wildlife photographer mauled by the very animal he was trying to document? The press will have a field day. Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. I know. What's our plan? For now, we control the narrative, Hawkins replied. We emphasize park safety protocols, the risks of wildlife photography, and the importance of respecting nature. We'll need to schedule a press conference soon. As they discussed the pending media response, Ben's room had quieted. His parents had stepped out to speak with Dr. Simmons, leaving Ben alone with his thoughts. He stared at the ceiling, the reality of his situation sinking in. The physical pain was intense, but it paled in comparison to the emotional turmoil. Fear, guilt, and uncertainty warred within him. Ben closed his eyes, remembering the bear's roar, the feeling of helplessness as it charged. He knew these memories would haunt him for a long time to come. A nurse entered, administering pain medication through his fore. As the drugs began to take effect, Ben felt himself drifting off. His last conscious thought was of the Alaskan wilderness, beautiful, powerful, and unforgiving. He wondered if he'd ever find the courage to return. As night fell over Anchorage, Ben slipped into a fitful sleep. Outside his room, the hospital bustled with activity. His family huddled together, discussing his care and recovery. Park officials prepared statements and organized search parties to monitor the attack site. And somewhere in the vast Alaskan wilderness, a large grizzly bear lumbered through the forest, unaware of the chaos it had caused in the human world, simply following its instincts in the untamed wild. 6 months after the bear attack, Ben Callahan gripped the parallel bars tightly, sweat beading on his forehead as he took another painstaking step forward. The physical therapy room at Anchorage Rehabilitation Center was filled with the quiet encouragement of staff and the determined grunts of patients working towards recovery. That's it, Ben, his physical therapist, Dr. Lisa Chun, encouraged. Just a few more steps. You're doing great. Ben gritted his teeth, pushing through the burning pain in his left leg. The scars from the bear attack had healed into angry red lines crisscrossing his skin, a constant reminder of his near-fatal encounter. As he reached the end of the bars, Ben let out a long, shaky breath. How's that? He asked, looking to Dr. Chun for approval. She smiled warmly. Excellent progress. Your gait is improving and you're putting more weight on that leg. How does it feel? Ben carefully lowered himself into a nearby chair. Better than last week, he admitted, but still a long way from normal. Dr. Chen nodded, making notes on her tablet. Recovery is a marathon, not a sprint, Ben. You've come incredibly far in 6 months. Many patients with injuries like yours take a year or more to get to where you are now. Ben managed a small smile, but his eyes held a hint of frustration. I know. I want to get back out there, you know? Back to my life. Dr. Chun sat down across from him, her expression serious. Ben, physically, you're making excellent progress, but I'm concerned about your mental state. Have you been seeing Dr. Winters regularly? Ben's smile faded. Dr. Sarah Winters was the psychologist assigned to help him deal with the PTSD from the attack. Yeah, I've been going, he said quietly. It's tough, talking about it, reliving it. I understand, Dr. Chon said gently, but it's a crucial part of your overall recovery. You can't heal your body if your mind is still trapped in that moment. Ben nodded, his gaze distant. I know, it's just, every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the bear's roar, feel its breath on my face. How do I move past that? Dr. Chun leaned forward, her voice compassionate but firm. By confronting it, Ben, by acknowledging your fear and your trauma and learning to manage it. Have you thought any more about the exposure therapy Dr. Winters suggested? Ben's hand unconsciously went to the scars on his leg. You mean going back to Katmai? I don't know if I'm ready for that. It doesn't have to be right away, Dr. Chan assured him. But it might be helpful to set it as a goal, something to work towards. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Ben's mother, Linda, poked her head in. Sorry to interrupt, but Ben has a visitor. That ranger from Katmai is here. Ben straightened up, surprised. Ranger Connors? Send her in, please. Moments later, Sarah Connors entered the room, still in her ranger uniform. She smiled warmly at Ben. Hello, Ben. It's good to see you up and about. Ben returned the smile, genuine pleasure breaking through his earlier melancholy. Sarah, what a surprise. What brings you to Anchorage? I'm here for a park service conference, Sarah explained. I thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing. You look great, by the way. Ben chuckled softly. Thanks. I feel a bit like Frankenstein's monster, but I'm getting there. Dr. Chun excused herself, leaving Ben and Sarah to talk. As they chatted, Ben found himself relaxing. Sarah's presence brought back memories not just of the attack, but of the rescue, the bravery of her team, the fact that he had survived against all odds. So, Sarah said after a while, her tone turning more serious, I heard from Dr. Winters that you're considering coming back to Katmai as part of your therapy. Any thoughts on that? Ben's smile faltered. I'm not sure. Part of me wants to face my fears, to not let this experience defeat me. But another part is terrified? Sarah finished for him. Ben nodded, grateful for her understanding. That's completely normal, Ben, Sarah assured him. What you went through, it would shake anyone to their core. But I want you to know that if you do decide to come back, we'll be there every step of the way. We've implemented new safety protocols, improved our tracking systems, and I'd personally oversee your visit. Ben felt a lump form in his throat, touched by her support. Thank you, Sarah. That means a lot. As Sarah left, promising to keep in touch, Ben felt a small spark of determination ignite within him. Maybe, just maybe, he could find the courage to return to the wild. Weeks passed, and Ben continued his rigorous physical therapy regimen. His leg grew stronger, his gait more natural, but the psychological scars proved harder to heal. In Dr. Winter's office, Ben sat fidgeting with a stress ball, his anxiety palpable. I had the dream again last night, he admitted. The one where I'm back in the forest, and I can hear the bear, but I can't see it. I'm running, but my legs won't move fast enough. Dr. Winters nodded, her pen scratching across her notepad. These recurring dreams are your mind's way of processing the trauma, Ben. They're unpleasant, but they're actually a sign of healing. Ben sighed, squeezing the stress ball tightly. It doesn't feel like healing. It feels like I'm stuck, reliving the worst moment of my life over and over. I understand, Dr. Winters said softly. But consider this, in your dreams, you're running. In reality, you couldn't. Your mind is already rewriting the narrative, giving you agency where you felt powerless before. Ben pondered this, his grip on the stress ball loosening slightly. I never thought of it that way. Dr. Winters smiled encouragingly. That's why we're here, Ben, to help you reframe these experiences, to find the strength within them. She paused, then asked, Have you given any more thought to returning to Katmai? Ben's hand went to his leg, an unconscious gesture he developed since the attack. I have, he admitted. I'm terrified, but I think I need to do it, to prove to myself that I can. Dr. Winters nodded approvingly. I think that's a wise decision, Ben. Facing our fears head-on is often the best way to overcome them. But remember, this isn't about pushing yourself too far, too fast. We'll prepare for this carefully, step by step. Over the next few weeks, Ben worked with Dr. Winters to prepare for his return to Katmai. They practiced visualization techniques, breathing exercises, and developed a detailed plan for the visit. Finally, the day arrived. Ben stood at the small airstrip near Katmai National Park, his heart pounding in his chest. Sarah Connors stood beside him, a reassuring presence. "Are you ready?" she asked gently. Ben took a deep breath, his hand clutching the strap of his camera bag. He debated whether to bring his equipment, unsure if he'd feel up to taking photos. In the end, he decided to bring it. Photography was part of who he was, bear attack or not. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, his voice shaky but determined. As they hiked into the park, Ben felt a mix of fear and awe wash over him. The Alaskan wilderness was as beautiful as he remembered majestic mountains, pristine forests, crystal clear streams. But now, every rustle in the bushes, every distant sound made him tense. Sarah noticed his unease. "Remember your breathing exercises," she reminded him gently. "We're perfectly safe. We have bear spray, we're making noise, and we're nowhere near any known den sites." Ben nodded, forcing himself to take slow, deep breaths. As they walked, he found himself relaxing incrementally. The familiar weight of his camera in his hands was comforting, and he began to take a few shots of the scenery. They reached a clearing overlooking a river. In the distance, a mother bear and her cubs were fishing for salmon. Ben froze, his breath catching in his throat. Sarah put a hand on his arm. "It's okay, Ben. They're far away, and they're focused on fishing. We're perfectly safe here. Take all the time you need." Ben nodded, unable to speak. He raised his camera with trembling hands, looking at the bears through his telephoto lens. The mother bear stood in the rushing water, alert and powerful. Her cubs played nearby, tumbling over each other in their excitement. As he watched, Ben felt something shift inside him. The bears weren't monsters. They were magnificent creatures, perfectly adapted to their environment. His fear began to melt away, replaced by a sense of wonder. "They're beautiful," he whispered, snapping photo after photo. Sarah smiled, relief evident in her voice. "Yes, they are. This is why we do what we do, Ben. To protect this, to allow people to experience this beauty, while keeping both humans and animals safe." They spent the rest of the day exploring the park. Ben took hundreds of photos, his passion for wildlife photography reigniting with each shot. By the time they returned to the ranger station, he was exhausted but exhilarated. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. Ben was quiet for a moment, reflecting. "Grateful," he finally said. "Grateful to be alive. Grateful to be here, seeing all this again. I was so afraid that the attack had taken this away from me forever. But it hasn't. I'm still me. I still love this." Sarah squeezed his shoulder gently. "I'm so glad to hear that, Ben. You've shown incredible courage today." As they flew back to Anchorage the next day, Ben felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced since before the attack. The fear wasn't gone entirely. He knew it might never completely disappear, but it no longer controlled him. In his next session with Dr. Winters, Ben recounted his experience at Katmai. "It was transformative," he said, a genuine smile on his face. "I felt like I was reclaiming a part of myself that I thought I'd lost." Dr. Winters beamed at him. "That's wonderful, Ben. This is a significant milestone in your recovery. How do you feel about your future now?" Ben's smile turned thoughtful. I think I'm ready to start planning my next photography trip. Maybe not to Katmai right away, but somewhere. I can't let fear keep me from doing what I love." As the session ended, Dr. Winters had one more question. "Ben, the Park Service has asked if you'd be willing to share your story. They're updating their wildlife safety materials and think your experience could help educate others. How do you feel about that? Ben was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he nodded. I think I'd like that. If my story can help prevent someone else from making the same mistakes I did, then some good can come out of all this. Over the next few months, Ben worked with the Park Service to develop new safety materials. He gave interviews, sharing his experience and the lessons he'd learned. His story resonated with many, and he found himself becoming an advocate for responsible wildlife photography. 1 year after the attack, Ben stood before a crowd at a wildlife photography conference in Anchorage. His legs still ached sometimes, and the scars were still visible, but he stood tall and confident. A year ago, he began, his voice strong. I made a mistake that nearly cost me my life. I forgot the most important rule of wildlife photography: respect. Respect for the animals, respect for their space, respect for the power of nature. He clicked through his slideshow, showing photos from before and after the attack. These bears, these wolves, these moose, they're not props for our photos. They're wild animals, deserving of our admiration and our caution. As photographers, we have a responsibility not just to capture their beauty, but to protect it, to educate others about the importance of maintaining a safe distance, of never interfering with wildlife, of preserving these incredible creatures in air habitats for future generations. As he concluded his speech, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Ben felt a surge of emotion, pride, gratitude, and a renewed sense of purpose. Later, as he packed up his equipment, a young photographer approached him. Mr. Callahan, your story, it's inspired me to be more careful in my own work. Thank you for sharing it. Ben smiled, touched by the young man's words. Thank you for listening. Remember, the best shot isn't worth your life. Respect the wildlife, respect yourself. As he left the conference center, Ben paused to look up at the Alaskan sky. The northern lights danced overhead, a reminder of the wild beauty he'd almost lost his life trying to capture. He took a deep breath, savoring the crisp air. Tomorrow, he'd be heading out on a new assignment, photographing brown bears in Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge. The familiar mix of excitement and trepidation stirred in his chest, but now it was tempered with wisdom and respect. Ben Callahan, wildlife photographer and survivor, was ready to face the wilderness again, this time on nature's terms.